Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Chapter 20. Excerpted from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travel homewards. The hour was as dismal as himself. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh. As if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed, all the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. Halloween night. Twilight. For the first time, the professor of early American studies seemed to realize that these mounting invasions, coincidences, nightmares, daydreams, were mounting towards something physical and determined to meet her. She looked around and saw that the sun was already turning, the western sky pink, and the whole of the eastern woods behind her was dark with deepening violet shadows. The town wouldn't be hard to get to before sunset, and with the Halloween revelries already commencing, she already felt hopeful of being greeted by the rollicking sounds of trick-or-treaters and the gleam of grinning pumpkins. She worked her way along the Douglas Park side of the Pocantico, looking from time to time over her shoulder to see if anything was tramping behind her. Although she didn't sense it, something was shifting in the atmosphere over the town. The sharp autumn air was rapidly dropping in temperature, and the leaden bank of low-hanging clouds was silently crawling in from the northeast, from Raven Rock. Their bellies were pregnant with snow, and they sagged from the weight of their icy burdens, scraping through tops of the trees. She had her back to the woods and didn't notice them gliding in. Nothing could force her to remain there a moment longer, though, and she picked up her pace without needing to hear the tinny clatter of sleet falling into the trees of Douglas Park. She felt as though she was making good progress. The encouraging glow of streetlights in the setting sun were peeking at her through the trees just around the next bend, a few 100 yards ahead. The southern edge of the park. There she would simply step off the path, cross between two houses, and find herself on Crane Avenue. A quick walk from the heart of Sleepy Hollow, milling with laughing people and flashing with faces that she need not fear. She looked back one last time at the broad, black bend in the river, where she had found the horseshoe. No one was following her as far as she could tell. She could hear nothing besides the lulling purr of the water and the hushing wind as it stirred the trees overhead. When she turned back around, however, he was waiting with open arms. Her face struck him in the breastbone, burying her nose into mildew-saturated wool as he greedily wrapped his long arms around her. She could feel the bones move loosely beneath his soggy white flesh and felt his lean jaw digging sharply into her scalp. She flailed in his grip but was surprised at the iron grip of his cadaverous arms. No matter what she did, she couldn't break free. To her horror, she felt him glide backwards into the thick trees of Douglas Park, dragging her with him, first upwards so that her feet were swinging above the ground, and then smoothly backwards into the woods. She forced one of her arms up under his embrace and pounded her fist into the face looming over her, a face she hadn't yet seen. Instinctively, she jabbed at his eyes, but her thumb found nothing to pierce, sinking instead into a moist, empty cavity. In a frenzied panic, she slapped at his nose and mouth, only to find the shriveled lips peeled back into a victorious grin. The nose was as hollow as the eyes. The teeth she touched seemed large and sharp. and they ground together ravenously. He was hungry, had always been hungry. Hungry as a pickpocket on the streets of Glasgow, hungry as a confidence man whose successful swindling of the incredulous Tobias Smollett and his editor Dr. John Moore led to his being driven across the sea to find new marks in a new world. He was hungry as a quack doctor, defunding the lonely lives of Boston sea captains with his bogus cures for syphilis, trading his tall tales and flattery for their money and their diseases. He was hungry as the owner of a privateer out of Mystic Harbor, where he had fled after his secrets were revealed in Boston, stealing the identity of one of his clients' drowned husbands, and taking merchant ships, British, French, and Yankees alike, as prizes to fill his purse and whet his appetite for wealth. He was hungry when he and his crew traveled over land to a rural port on the Hudson River, rented out a sloop and used it to smuggle European contraband to the rebels upstate and intelligence to the British in Manhattan. He was hungry when he begged by an overexcited militiaman to help defend a bridge that could easily be secured by a lousy corporal's guard. How she seemed to realize this, she didn't know, but a confluence of realizations caused her to shudder in rage and horror, and she screamed as she tore at his rotten wool jacket, while her feet kicked above the ground against the saplings and logs that whizzed beneath them. She could tell that they were gliding quickly above the ground, but she still couldn't see with her face pressed into his bony chest. She thought of the cleft in Raven Rock, how it seemed like a lion's den, and had been strewn with gnawed bones and smelled of moldy earth. The same sour reek that filled her mouth and nostrils right now. She desperately reached for her knapsack, for anything sharp or heavy, tore open one of the side pockets and felt her fingers smack against something hard. Gripping it tight, she pulled it out and drove whatever it was home into his vacant eyes. The gliding stopped, the grip loosened as the spiny hands flew to its face, and she fell to the ground. She must have been 3 or 4 feet in the air, and the fall knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her dazed and overwhelmed by a ringing sound. Her knapsack snagged on the splintered branch of a tulip tree and was torn off in the fall, leaving her without a phone, with its GPS and flashlight to help her find her way back to safety. Something heavy landed beside her with a clinking thud. It was the horseshoe, which she had buried into the tall, thin man's eye sockets. Looking up into the deep purple twilight around them, in a part of the woods that she didn't recognize, she could see a bent black figure hovering over her. In the faint afterglow of sunset, she could hazily make out a whitish face, gouged with 3 ragged holes, framed by stingy shags of molting red hair, quivering with gluttonous rage. She glanced over at the horseshoe, her only available weapon, but her head was swimming far too much to reach out for it. The tall, thin man floated to the ground and dropped to all 4s, slowly crawling towards her, gently moving his dry, white head back and forth, with his nose in the air, making a sucking, moaning sound as he smelled through the gash in his parchment skin. She lurched backwards, scooting through the brown carpet of leaves as his long arms pulled him closer to her, but the throbbing in her head pulled her back to the earth. She slumped against a maple tree and closed her eyes as the forest spun around her, and she heard the crunch of leaves as he rose over her on his knees. He gripped her by the shirt and pulled her up. She felt his knuckles digging into her. He was real. The physics made no sense. It defied all science. She didn't believe in visions, or ghosts, or the afterlife, but she felt the sharp fingernails gouging her skin, and felt the pain as they dug in and drew blood. And she felt and smelled the clammy, rancid breath on her face as he drew her closer to his grinding teeth, large and sharp. Suddenly, the air was charged with a strange, sensual odor, like sweet musk and lavender. She felt something filling the atmosphere around them, as if the owner to a home had just returned, interrupting a struggle between two rival housebreakers. The owner had unquestionably arrived, but who she was or what she claimed ownership over, or by what right, the professor of early American studies wasn't in a situation to guess. Whoever she might be, though the professor somehow knew, almost as if she could viscerally taste it, that the owner was tremulous with a searing rage, a fury that boiled in the atmosphere, radiating like a scarlet signal fire flaming from the top of a rocky peak, summoning a long-forgotten sentinel, a patient watchman who had been quietly standing guard for her for 3 centuries and more. And almost instantly, she felt the rhythmic vibrations of his arrival. The pounding clatter of horse hooves on packed earth didn't surprise her, just because she knew that there wasn't a road near them. Even without knowing where they were, she could see the unbroken tangle of briars and thickets surrounding them. But because she thought he had left her, he was the last person she expected to see. Immediately, she no longer smelled its moldy breath, a uniquely heavy, sweet, spoiled odor like bad milk, or heard the grinding of its ravenous teeth. There was no sound of movement, but she sensed that it had been removed somehow transmuted into a different expression of itself, from a different sliver of its miserable existence. Her mind whirled uncontrollably, and with each dip of her head and closing of her increasingly heavy eyes, she saw a different tableau. She was seeing a man, tall but exceedingly lank, whose leprous face was briefly illuminated as he blew onto the smoldering cord of a slow match in the early morning murk. She was seeing a leering, ogling pair of green eyes and a watering mouth illuminated by the strobing light of a fireplace in a wood-beamed parlor darkened by the shadows of dancers and steaming with dishes of roasted meat and cider punches. She was seeing a craven, scowling visage, glowing by the red light of a lantern swinging from the pommel of an old horse's saddle, whose eyes peered anxiously into the darkness that was now drawing a velvet curtain over it all. As everything faded to black, she could see 2 galloping horsemen darting down a woodland road, stones flying, sparks flashing at every bound, over the road, plunging down. Into the hollow they raced, over logs, under branches, galloping side by side, with their figures vaguely outlined in silver splatters of moonlight. Through the fog of her fading consciousness, she thought she heard a retching scream and a hoarse voice begging for mercy in a chattering brogue.
For God's sake, dinna come and na nearer. Keep off, you devil. You damn bogey. Na mair. Na mair. I beseech you, begone from me, you nasty thing. Canna you leave me in peace?
Among the thundering clatter of hooves, she heard the shrill grating of tempered steel against rough leather. Although it was virtually impossible to see in the darkness, she could make out a tall, bony man in billowing loose garments, followed closely by a headless rider, huge, misshapen, and towering on a powerful gray horse, rushing by like a midnight blast. Chapter 21. Halloween night, the witching hour. When she opened her eyes, she saw Raven Rock looming over her like a waiting sepulchre. Molten moonlight splashed over its craggy surface, pooling quietly at its base. Soft flakes of snow were drifting through the trees and gleaming like sapphires. How she had traveled almost 4 miles. From Douglas Park, she couldn't imagine. But as her consciousness began to sharpen, she knew that was the least of her concerns. At first she tried to stand, but her head was still slushing with blood, and as she only got as far as sitting up and leaning against one of the boulders, there, behind her, she could see the shallow den connected to the woman in white story. After this night's experiences, she shuddered to look closely at it, but immediately saw that it was empty, even if it was drenched in sorrowful shadows. No ghostly woman huddled inside. frozen to the ground with her discolored eyes bulging out. Neither was there the sour-smelling trash heap of gnawed carcasses. It was simply dark and empty, patiently anticipating. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the rock caught her ear. She slowly turned to see him watching her from his saddle, with his light cavalry saber gleaming in the soft light of the moon. No, not watching it. He was aware of her. She felt sure, but he was bent achingly over the pommel, his throat ending in a pulpy purple gash. Black stains soaked his collar, which had been torn open in the cannon blast, and ran down the front of his shirt. The exposed skin was the same pale marbled green as his hands, and she again saw the cauterized punctures in his throat and chest, where he had been gored by grape shot. Here was the weary phantom of her childhood nightmares, the dismembered shade who had so quickly been forgotten since leaving for college. Since her graduation, her marriage, her career, her divorce, her parents' deaths, since that first vision of him shambling out of the woods, she had morphed him into something entirely different, a shadow of her own inner demons, hungry, desperate, and vicious. In her scholarship, she had written of the horseman as the animus of unfettered masculinity, violently irrational and symbolically divorced from reason. She had written of him as a trope of dominance and power, a fascist archetype in black leather, lashing out in irrational ruthlessness with his phallic sword. He had been savage, a jackbooted id, a Teutonic stormtrooper, deaf to reason and blind to circumstance, pure, raging, destructive emotion, the totem of human brutality, just one of many monsters created by war. When she looked at the sagging, ragged corpse clinging weakly to the reins, she didn't see any of those things. She saw weariness and isolation and years of frantic chasing after vaporized dreams. She wondered what emotion she could have read on his face, had he had one. He wasn't just unable to rationally pursue peaceful conflict resolution. He was unable to share eye contact, unable to whisper a secret, unable to smile back at a friend who had guessed his thoughts, unable to communicate frustration, fear, or love. He was unable to be recognized, to be seen, to be known, or make himself known. He was unable to be awoken by the sounds of a fresh fire snapping in the hearth, bringing warmth to a cold winter morning, unable to fall asleep to the restful patter of summer rain on the window of a dry bedroom. He was unable to savor the flesh of fresh-baked rye, brushed over with farmer's butter by his grandmother, unable to relish the flavor of strong coffee. He hadn't been severed from empathy and reason. He has been severed from his own identity. He wasn't a specter of mindless aggression. He was a phantom of irredeemable alienation. He didn't tear across the hollow in search of a head to steal, but in search of a face to recognize him. He was like her in many ways, distrusted, disliked, difficult to understand. They both prowled around the borders of society, looking in with curiosity but keeping a safe distance, out of some nameless fear of what might happen if they let go of their power. They were both ghosts in their own ways, and she looked at him in quiet horror, as if she were looking into the fractured mirror of a dozen replicas of her own face. He sat there with his shoulders turned in her direction, as jets of steam gushed in regular bursts from his horse's nostrils, the lights from the moon outlining them in golden brushstrokes, dripping down the horse's legs and forming puddles at his hooves. Looking down, she noticed that for all his demoniacal speed, the horse was holding his right foreleg at an awkward angle and preferring his left side. She moved closer. Her head was no longer swimming. In fact, she felt strangely light and saw that he was missing a shoe. She looked around but remembered that her knapsack had become snagged and lost somewhere in Douglas Park, and the shoe had undoubtedly been left behind as well. But on second glance, she saw it glinting in the starlight at the foot of Raven Rock, where she had been laying. It gleamed an inky blue, shining cleanly in the moon glow as if all the rust of 3 centuries and more had somehow fallen away. Time seemed to slow and drip watchfully around her as she reached for it, wrapped her fingers around the sleek iron. It was strangely warm and alive. She carried it over to him and held it up. The spongy neck bent over it in a moment of weary relief, and with light bound, he jumped from the saddle and held out his hand. The moon shone through his long fingernails and the dry webbing that clung to his bony fingers like parchment. She held it out by one side, toe facing up, and he gripped it from the other like a wishbone. For a few seconds they were each holding on to it, and she felt as though they were building a bridge between dimensions cleaved by an incomprehensible gulf. An electric smolder burned warmly between them, and then she slowly let it go, passing it over into his control. He stood there for a somber moment, then returned to his steaming horse. Reaching into a leather saddlebag, he pulled out a pouch and a small hammer, and he bent stoically over the limp leg before tenderly lifting it and running his mottled hand over the hoof, like a parson praying over a sick child. One by one, he drove 6 nails through the hoof until the shoe was fixed in place, and the horseman stroked the leg several times before standing up. The horse smote his hoof into the ground, and the shoe sparked cleanly against a rock. Something changed in the atmosphere, as if it had been invested with a charge of electricity. The air was suddenly filled with a warm, familiar aroma, like sweet musk and lavender. The snow began to float down in shaggy tufts like cottonwood blooms in spring. It clung gently to her hair and clothes, sticking in downy patches to his bent shoulders and his horse's mane. She looked closely at the clenched hands and bowing spine and felt the weight of centuries radiating from his bent body. What weighed on him? What had kept him stapled to this 2-mile radius of earth for 240 miserable years? Ranging the hills of an indifferent foreign country. An impossible search for a head that had been ground to meal by grape shot? A fleshy pulp of brain matter and bone splinters? No, she thought it must be something much different. Something more permanent than dying flesh, more eternal than bone and blood. Her skin began to smart from the cold. She felt its weight as it began to pile around them in drifting banks. A black bird suddenly launched from the top of a spruce tree overlooking them and faded silently into the sky as its wings glinted in the buttery moonlight. She remembered. She still didn't know what had kept him that night, or how the miscommunication had happened between them, but he was here now, here, where he said he would be. He took a step forward to remount, but she rushed forward and grabbed him by the arm. What she felt wasn't pleasant or wholesome. She felt rotten flesh sliding on dead bones beneath the musty wool jacket, but she didn't mind. She was rotten on the inside too in other ways. He stopped moving and turned towards her, surprised. She put her arms around his chest and buried her face into his mildewed clothes. There was no less stench of foulness in him than she had smelled with her face pressed against the pedagogue's bony corpse, but it didn't bother her. She recognized the odor in herself and held him all the tighter. Softly, almost nervously, he folded his arms over her, and they stood there in the cold light of the October moon pouring silently into one another. She reached back and touched his hand, living flesh to dead flesh, and brought it up to her lips. It felt strangely warm, or perhaps her lips were cold. As she kissed it once, twice, and 3 times, she looked up into his face. His eyes were striking, a smoldering dark brown that burned like a tree scorched by black lightning. She remembered how they met, when he helped her father after their cart became mired in the spring mud, and of how they exchanged overly long glances while he and his men pushed them free. He was a gallant young lieutenant in a pine green jacket with apple-red facings and caramel-colored buckskin breeches. His dark eyes were sad but kind, and his smile was strangely tilted, as if he was always thinking about 2 things at the same time. His laugh was deep and soft, his arms were strong, his heart was good. She recalled the short nights in May and June, of how she would linger in her father's orchard at twilight, while the fireflies burned warmly in the field of buckwheat, and how he would come riding quietly through the woods on the other side of old Acker's property. The air was sweet with cut grass and warm rains, and his eyes sparked knowingly as the fireflies pulsated around them. She would dab herself with sweet musk and twist lavender into her glossy ginger hair. Her breath was cool from peppermint leaves, and he would smell of campfire and saddle leather and pine needles. She knew some German from the immigrant families in Tarrytown, and he knew Dutch and had picked up English from the British soldiers. They learned from each other and spent the twilight hours picking grapes and berries in the shadows of the Ackers woods, laying in the tall, swaying grass under the bright blue heavens. They saw such grand castles in the clouds that passed, forever flushing round the summer sky. She thought back to nights when the town held dances and how, although he could never dare show his face there with his green coat, he would wait for her in the arbor outside. And they would whisper in the darkness dappled by starlight. As the night deepened and then softened with pearly gray light, he would mount his charger and sprint off down the Albany Post Road at a rushing speed, like a midnight blast, owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to camp before the daybreak reveille. She thought of how he must never have received her summons, and how he lived the final months of his life recklessly at breakneck pace, volunteering for foolhardy missions that took him back to the fields and brooks where they had courted. She imagined him reorganizing his detachment after his commander was torn in half by grapeshot. It would be understandable to retreat, and no shame or disgrace would come on him if they fired back and made an organized withdrawal back into the dark cover of Wiley's swamp, and thence to their stables at Kingsbridge. She imagined him weighing the danger and rallying a few men who were as reckless as he into the final charge, while the loathsome Yankee captain, an ambitious, gangly charlatan who knew full well that he had nothing to lose and everything to gain by taking over command of the militia's defense, trained a 3-pounder field piece loaded with musket balls on the bridge and put match to powder. In a flash, she heard the buzzing, waspy whine of grapeshot, saw the head eaten away from the shoulders in a scarlet mist, and smelled the metallic stench of blood as the vapor settled onto the bridge, where he and his horse tumbled down, dead. As the animal clattered forward, it struck its hoof against one of the bridge supports and threw its shoe. It clinked off the bridge and plopped onto the black bed of the river, which swallowed it like a restless memory. She thought of the years, then decades, then centuries, that they had wasted. She in howling anger at having been abandoned, and he in reckless shame at losing her. But here in the molten moonlight, her anger evaporated in a mellow steam of peace, and his shame fell from his back like a hefty cloak. They had held on to their misery for so long, hands clenched desperately around it, that they were unable to receive the relief that now filled their open palms like rivers of rain on parched fields. An inconceivable peace folded over them as they opened their rotten souls to one another and to the streaming snow around them. The living starlight burned away the dead dust of cemeteries. The icy rain soothed the scalding rage and regret, which rose harmlessly into the infinity above them like rushing clouds of mist blown away by the wholesome wind. He folded his arm around her waist and ran his hand down the white satin brocade until it rested on the small of her back. He placed the other hand gently at the base of her neck, beneath the pile of ginger hair, and brought his fingers slowly around her jaw and to her chin, which he held between his thumb and forefinger. The moonlight gleamed in her eyes. They were a strange shade of deep purple, and they flashed like pools of wine in candlelight. She slipped her hand up the nape of his neck and lost her fingers in his curly black hair. As they kissed, he gripped her more tightly about the waist and pulled her up off the ground, hoisting her onto his horse with him. She put both arms around him and pressed her face into his chest. His uniform was forest green and smelled of campfire smoke, saddle leather, and pine needles. She slid her hand under his jacket and held him by the ribs. They were warm and firm. At first, when he spurred the horse forward, they bounced roughly down the path from Raven Rock, clattering over stones and scattered gravel at each bound. But as they rose up the incline of a hill, the vibration suddenly ceased, and the air seemed lighter around her. Now they had stopped altogether, and the only sound was the hushing of the brisk air flowing over them as the stars burned on all sides, like fireflies in fields of buckwheat. The cold melted away as they rose past the tree line and into the light of the full gaping moon, while the white satin skirts of her dress rustled in the wind. They were racing faster and higher and deeper into a black limitless gulf. And she welcomed the longed-for surrender as flesh and bone translated into something incomprehensibly fluid and indivisibly whole. Chapter 22. Excerpted from Codified Community, Sleepy Hollow's Folkloric Ethos, by Madison Gray Kilroy, Ph.D., age 28. On one hand, Irving loved company dearly. He could be accused of being a clingy friend and uncle. But on the other hand, he loved being able to go to bed alone, rise when he wanted, do work when it suited him, and leave from place to place without responsibility. Much like British ghostwriters M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, and William Hope Hodgson, bachelorhood suited his independent disposition, but unquestionably fed his imagination with the horrors of loneliness. His ghost stories are haunted by specters of anxiety, headless horsemen who taunt their victims with their anonymity and existential unimportance, loitering ghosts who intoxicate their guests with the alienating liquor of idleness, and mocking ghost pirates who taunt treasure hunters with the meaningless of wealth and materialism. But at the core of all his stories was one lingering idée fixe, an obsession with finding home and belonging, with bringing the wanderer to a place of reconciliation and peace with their pasts. Sometimes, in the case of Ichabod Crane, their hearts were too cold and their souls too hell-bent on standing out to receive the gift of community. Other times, in the case of Rip Van Winkle, Dolph Halliger, or Wolfert Weber, they are able to accept their losses, confront the cost of their stubborn pride, and return to the open arms waiting to receive them. This is the most desired for ending in Irving's works, to come home. But homecoming always has a cost, and sometimes that cost is quite dear. Epilogue, excerpted from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. If ever I should wish for a retreat, whither I might steal from the world and its distractions, and dream quietly away the remnants of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. All Saints' Day, the break of dawn. The weather reports had not called for snow, but before dawn there were 7-inch drifts in the hollow, and a mixture of sleet was pelting the ghosts in the trees and freezing the jack-o'-lanterns in icy shells. Mrs. Van Brunt was worried when the professor of early American studies failed to show up to the town play, but her husband and children convinced her not to put so much stock in her absence. But on the morning of All Saints' Day, they couldn't prevent her from visiting her Airbnb with a slice of pumpkin pie as a parting gift. She was less surprised than shocked to find an irate Lyft driver sitting in the driveway, calling her phone every 10 minutes. Mrs. Van Brunt contacted the police, but set out on her own as soon as she hung up, rushing with careful tiny steps down the icy driveway. With her husband and 2 oldest sons, she searched the banks of the Pocantico in vain. The police would later find recently crushed briars near the southern end of Douglas Park with bits of clothing and hair snagged in them, as if someone had been pulled off the trail and yanked into the underbrush. They would find a strange path of broken branches, shrubs, and limbs strewn along a northwest tack, but no footprints were found, and none of the leaves or undergrowth near the ground were disturbed. In the middle of the park they found her knapsack caught on a tree, and at its base the earth and leaves were stirred up by a struggle. At this point things became even stranger. They found hoofprints pounded into the damp soil, 2 pairs of them, which illustrated a frantic race through the woods and towards a bend in the river where the water ran deep and black. The prints seemed to have begun at a spot 200 yards east of where the knapsack was found, but they appeared to have materialized from no place in particular. Although it was hard to tell, one expert believed that one of the horses only had 3 shoes. The right foreleg was unshod, but no missing horseshoe was ever found. The tracks deeply dented a hiking trail, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to a bend in the Pocantico, where they stopped at the river's edge without any sign of where the riders went from there. On the western bank of that broad part of the brook, however, where the waters ran deep and black, was found a red wool cap, faded and old, and close beside it, poking from the muddy riverbank, the brown moldering dome of a human skull. Closer inspection and a painstaking excavation found that it was part of a whole skeleton, which had been buried under the serpentine roots of a massive, lightning-stricken oak, whose black carcass loomed over the spot like a gibbet laden with bloated corpses. Experts allayed public fears by pointing out that it was at least 200 years old, and that it had only been exposed by the gradual erosion of the soil around the tree's base. They were the remains of a tall man in his 40s who had been decapitated and buried in the clay years before the tree sprouted from the dank earth of his grave. The skull was horribly disfigured by syphilis. The teeth were large and sharp. This was all discovered after the fact, however. It was a police investigation, not a search party. For after Mrs. Van Brunt failed to find any signs of her friend on the banks of the Pocantico, she and her husband and sons come with her to Buttermilk Hill. She was far too afraid to go alone, and she had decided to look there only as a last resort. They left the car in the parking lot and went down the trail to Raven Rock, as the snow drifted down like falling ash from a burning house. None of the familiar black birds, those croaking, greasy watchmen, were to be seen. The nude trees were clear of their leering silhouettes, and their thorny nests atop the rock were abandoned. The only sign of life came from two sparrows who quietly leapt from their perches at the Van Brunt's approach and made their way through the trees, effortlessly disappearing into the snowy skies. The morning sun was covered in snow clouds, but a steely blue light filtered through the top of the trees like gentle fingers reaching to recover some precious lost thing. They found her where they expected to find her, as they expected to find her. Her arms were folded in front of her, not around herself, as if she were holding on to some precious lost thing, and her purple lips were pressed into a strange, distant smile.
Chilling tales for dark nights.